Hello everyone, me again. Here's yet another podcasted lesson. Before we start this one, this podcast is a series of lessons on the final year of the war. Just a quick word. I know that Miss King will have will have told you the reasons why I was not in last week, and unfortunately, given the circumstances, which I know you're aware of, I won't be in. I doubt for this week, so there's going to be 3 more podcasted lessons. I do apologise for that, but I do know you understand, and I'm sure the podcast will work for you. Send me an email if you've got any questions. That's the important thing. Okay, so we'll push on. This is a podcast on the final year of the war, as you can see from the heading there. We've pretty much covered a lot of this in the last couple of lessons, but it's an extra lesson I wanted just to put in because just to make sure you're comfortable with the chronology, with the series of events in the last year of the war. So there's the outline of what we've been doing. Ever such a quick look. So we've done the origins of the First World War outline. We've done Germany and Germany's responsibility for that. We did a lesson on reasons for Germany's defeat, and then the last lesson was on the domestic impact of war. Now you can see where we're going beyond that. German Revolution, Weimar Constitution, Treaty of Versailles, and then into the 4-year crisis. 1919 to 23. But what I'm doing here is I'm inserting an extra lesson in at that point, okay, which is on the final year of the war, just to make sure you're absolutely clear of the chronology before we move into the German Revolution, which will be the next lesson. Okay, so let's just push on. There's the mind map. You'll see it in the folder. Hopefully you have been given a paper copy of that before you watch this particular podcast. So as you can see, I'm going to break this lesson down into 4 areas. The fall of Bethmann-Hollweg, which is what we're going to do in this podcast, and you'll then move into the military dictatorship, impact of the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the military collapse and what we call the October Reform. So 4 short podcasts, each will be, as before, around about 10 minutes. That will make up the whole lesson. Okay, so play each of these podcasts in sequence. So we'll zoom straight into then the fall of Bethmann-Hollweg. Okay, so we have touched upon this on the previous podcasts, so that this shouldn't be new to you. Incidentally, I have done a Prezi on this. Obviously, there's no commentary, but when you download the slideshow, where it says "click here" on that particular slide, if you click at that point, it'll take you to a Prezi, and you can play the Prezi, which is pretty much the same slides that you're looking at here, but it's done represented visually around a map. And I wanted to start with that map. So just zoom in a little bit. Be very mindful of the fact that Germany was allied to AustriaHungary, and that's a big factor. We're talking about Germany's increasing inability to cope with the war. She was dependent on AustriaHungary as her ally, particularly as Austria-Hungary was fighting against Russia in the east. So the war effort against Russia was a joint effort, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Part of the background to this is Austria-Hungary was increasingly weakening, and by the end of 1917, Austria-Hungary was pretty much an ineffective ally, which put increased effort on Germany. The dashed lines are the 2 fronts as they were in 1914. Okay, that's 1914 at the start of the war. So that gives you a good sense of how the war was always fought abroad. Okay, at no point in World War I was there any fighting on German soil. Okay, because at the beginning of the war, in both the west and the east, Germany advanced to those areas. And the 2 sides then dug themselves into trenches. Okay. So the fall of Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg. Story starts in July 1917. There was basically a parliamentary revolt in Germany. Popular disillusionment across the whole of Europe with the war. If you look at Carr, pages 225 to 6, he does talk about how, for example, in France there were army mutinies. In Britain there was disillusionment with the war as well. It wasn't just in Germany. I mean, in Britain there were strikes in factories. It wasn't just in Germany. Pretty much there was civilian populations throughout the whole of Germany were turning against the war, realising increasingly that the annexationists, the German High Command, pushing for a war without compromise, a war in which there would be annexation in the East. Increasingly, by this point in time, there was disillusionment. One of the spurs for that, of course, was that in Russia, the Tsar had abdicated, and so there was the revolutionary mood in Russia was increasingly spreading to Germany, and civilian populations in Germany were thinking, well, we need to bring an end to this war as quickly as possible. In part, certainly the middle classes, to forestall the risk of revolution in Germany, but also obviously the working classes themselves wanted to follow the example of what happened in Russia. Now that was evident in July, on the 19th of July 1917, there was this very famous vote. The Reichstag passed a peace resolution. It voted by 212 votes against 126 to end the war. It was a real shock to the military high command. Up to that point, obviously the SPD had split, and the independent socialists on the far left had turned against the war. The majority socialists, there was no surprise that they voted against the war. What was a big surprise here with this vote was the Catholic Centre Party. Now, the leader of the Catholic Centre Party, Matthias Erzberger, and he's mentioned on page 226 of Carr, had at the beginning of the war been a very, very solid annexationist. You know, he believed that the war should be fought and won, and would be based on no compromise. But he had now changed his side, and he took the Centre Party with him on that particular vote. So the vote that the Reichstag rejected the idea of annexation. It publicly said that the most important thing now was bringing an end to the war, and it must be a peace based on compromise, that it mustn't be about greedily demanding territory. It's got to be based on a quick peace. So the resolution reflected, as I say, the increasing leftward move of many Germans, not just the working classes, but now the middle classes increasingly turning against the war. And part of that was because they were afraid that the longer the war went on, the greater the risk of a socialist revolution in Germany. Now, Hindenburg and Ludendorff blamed Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg for failing to keep the Reichstag in order. That was very, very clear. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, from their point of view, believed the war had to be won, that it could be won in the east, that Germany could annex vast swathes of territory in the east, and they blamed the Chancellor for failing to keep the Reichstag in order. And so they sent him a telegram threatening resignation unless the peace resolution were withdrawn. Now the Kaiser, what then happened at this particular stage just demonstrates how weak the Kaiser was. The Kaiser should have stood with Bethmann-Hollweg. The Kaiser, it was his responsibility to support Bethmann-Hollweg. The Kaiser had no other candidate. There was no other suitable candidate to become Chancellor. As far as he was concerned, Bethmann-Hollweg was still the best person to rule. But yet the Kaiser could not stand up against Hindenburg and Ludendorff. So the Kaiser caught indecisively, not knowing what to do. Bethmann-Hollweg, loyal to the last to the Kaiser, to spare him that embarrassment, resigned. And if you go to William Carr, page 226 to 227, a very good little section that really, very good point being made, that it exemplifies how the Kaiser was effectively now weak and he was not really running the country. So to finish off this particular podcast, what then happened was the new Chancellor was actually not even a nominee of the Kaiser. Okay, the new Chancellor was chosen by Ludendorff, which sums up how much the country by this point was being run by the military high command. So Chancellor Michaelis, he did not have the confidence of the Reichstag at all. He was purely a puppet of the military high command of the OHL of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. So it was now clear that the government was entirely being manipulated by the Army Supreme Command. The Kaiser was not in control. So that's the end of this particular podcast. The next one, podcast 2, goes straight onto it. It's about the military dictatorship as it was in the final year of the war. Thank you.